Now, I don't know about you, but when I look at the life of Paul and I read through Acts and I read through his letters, I think it's safe to say that Paul was one of the most afflicted persons that's ever lived. He says elsewhere in his letters that he suffered cold, he suffered nakedness, he suffered beating, imprisonment, criminal assault, shipwreck, betrayal of his closest friends, desolation, desertion, all sorts of things. And in this passage, he gives just one example. He could have written an even longer letter if he'd gone through all of them. But the one example he gives is in verse 8. We think you ought to know, dear brothers and sisters, about the trouble we went through in the province of Asia. We were crushed and overwhelmed beyond our ability to endure, and we thought that we would never live through it. Here is Paul, who is willing to be vulnerable enough with a church that he had a pretty difficult relationship with, to put it very mildly. But he's vulnerable enough to share his weakness with them. And not only his weakness, but his inability to endure the sufferings that he was going through. There must have been times when Paul wondered why God allowed all these things to happen to him. But through them all, we know that Paul held on to the hope that God has the power to bring the good out of bad. That's why in Romans 8:28, which we shared at the beginning of our meeting, Paul says, and we know that God causes everything. Just think about what is encompassed by everything just in Paul's life. We know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. In all of these trials, Paul testifies that God comforted him through them. Paul held on to the belief that God was sovereign over every circumstance, even the most difficult ones in his lives. He held on to the hope and the belief that evil and sin cannot win, that God's will and power will have the victory over all of these difficult circumstances. He holds on to the belief that God is with him in his suffering, that he sustains in it, and he delivers it from him, and that he was not indifferent to Paul's pain.